This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The New York Times is reportedly conducting an internal investigation to identify the source behind leaked information about its coverage of Israel and Gaza. According to Vanity Fair, the internal investigation follows a report in The Intercept about the Times shelving an episode of its podcast, The Daily, over doubts regarding the accuracy of a highly controversial blockbuster New York Times article published at the end of December, alleging Hamas members committed widespread sexual violence, weaponized it on October 7th. Vanity Fair reports that in recent weeks, management of the New York Times have questioned at least 24 staffers, including producers of The Daily, the podcast, in an attempt to understand how internal details about the podcast's editorial process got out. Democracy Now! Asked the New York Times about the internal investigation. The paper's international editor, Phil Pan, said in a statement, quote, "We aren't going to comment on internal matters. I can tell you the work of our newsroom requires trust and collaboration, and we expect all of our colleagues to adhere to these values," end quote. The New York Times article at the center of the controversy was published December 28th. It was headlined, "Screams Without Words: How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th. In it, the Times reported they had found evidence of systematic sexual violence orchestrated by Hamas, and that their 2-month investigation, quote, "uncovered painful new details establishing that the attacks against women were not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern of gender-based violence, October 7th, unquote. However, not long after the highly publicized article was published, major discrepancies began to emerge, including public comments from the family of a major subject of the article, contradictory claims from a key witness, and criticisms over a lack of solid evidence in the overall investigation. Then news emerged last week that one of the 3 authors of the New York Times piece, named Anat Schwartz, had liked multiple posts on social media advocating for violence against Palestinians, including one that called for turning Gaza into a slaughterhouse. Anat Schwartz is an Israeli filmmaker who had no prior reporting experience before she was assigned by the Times to work on the major investigation, along with Adam Sella and veteran Times reporter Jeffrey Gettleman. On Wednesday, The Intercept published another in-depth investigation that further questions the Times article and the reporting process behind it. It's headlined "Between the Hammer and the Anvil: The Story Behind the New York Times October 7th Exposé." And the 2 Intercept reporters who wrote it join us today. Jeremy Scahill is a senior reporter and correspondent at The Intercept. He's joining us from Germany. And Ryan Grimm is The Intercept's bureau chief in Washington, D.C., where he joins us from. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Jeremy, let's begin with you. Can you lay out first the significance of the New York Times article that's at the center of the controversy, and then talk about your latest piece that looks into how it all came about?
Well, Amy, in early December, you had the death toll skyrocketing in Gaza. You had a number of nations, including those that are allies with Israel, starting to speak out about the death toll among women, children, the elderly. And part of a pattern of what we've seen throughout the course of these 5 months of scorched earth attacks against Gaza is that whenever Israel perceives itself to be losing the narrative war, or when it needs to remind the public of its perception that Israel is the only victim in this story, they unload a new round of attacks against a variety of individuals or organizations that are working in Gaza or living in Gaza, human beings. We saw that with the attacks against UNRWA. We saw that with the attacks against Al-Shifa and other hospitals. And in early December, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government really began an intense propaganda campaign to convince the world that Hamas had engaged in a systematic campaign of rape aimed at Jewish women and girls. And then they launched this fake criticism of feminist organizations, saying that they had all systematically failed to stand up and denounce this systematic rape regime that had been intentionally implemented by Hamas in the October 7th attacks. And on the day that Netanyahu made his most prominent statement about this, President Biden was at a fundraising event in Boston, and he made a statement at his speech that echoed what Netanyahu said, and said the world, can't turn away and ignore this. Well, what was happening at that very moment was that the New York Times, with one of its most prominent international correspondents, Jeffrey Gettleman, he had recently hit the ground in Israel, and he was working. Gettleman enlisted the help of two individuals that were going to work with him there. And Gettleman had proposed three lines of investigation, and one of them was the issue of sexual violence. And the two individuals that Gettleman was working with, one of them is a very young person who's only recently gotten into journalism, Adam Sella. And he had mostly been like a food journalist and has a background in looking at agricultural issues, et cetera. He had started to write some freelance pieces that were dipping into the waters of politics and the conflict, but a quite inexperienced reporter. And then the other was someone with no reporting experience outside of making some documentary films, and that is Anat Schwartz. It's unclear how Anat Schwartz in particular got involved with this project. And as you mentioned, she had early on in the Israeli attacks against Gaza liked a tweet that actually was cited by the International Court of Justice as a statement of potential genocidal incitement. She also liked a tweet from the Israeli government promoting the debunked allegation that 40 babies had been beheaded on October 7th, which is entirely false, as well as another tweet that said we must just refer to Hamas as ISIS. And so they start off on this investigation, and our understanding from sources is that the overwhelming majority of the interviews and reporting that was being done on the ground was being handled by Anat Schwartz and Adam Sella. And we discovered a podcast interview with Anat Schwartz in Hebrew that she gave, where it's a shocking podcast in how much detail she offers about the process that they used when they were reporting it. And just to put it in a nutshell, she describes how the first thing that she did was start to call around to what she describes as all of the Israeli hospitals that have facilities that are called Room 4 facilities. These would be the intake places where people who have been victims of sexual crimes, including assault and rape, et cetera, where they would be examined or their cases would be referred. And she said that not a single one of them reported that they had any reports of sexual assault or rape on October 7th. She then started calling around to Rape Crisis Hotline and describes how she had what she described as an intense conversation with the manager of the Rape Crisis Hotline in that part of Israel, where she was dumbfounded when he was saying he didn't have any calls reporting sexual assault or rape. And she's saying, how is this possible? And then she starts talking, she goes to a holistic therapeutic center that was established at a former high-end retreat center outside of Tel Aviv, where mostly people from the Nova rave, where there were attacks and where a couple of hundred people were killed. It was a place where people could do alternative medicine and yoga, relaxation therapy. I mean, people who were highly traumatized. And she goes there, and her characterization was that she sensed what she called a conspiracy of silence among the therapists, because none of them were telling her, yes, we're treating people who were raped or had experienced sexual assault. And so when she went through all the official channels, the places where you would reach out to see if you're exploring if there's a pattern here, what then happened is she starts to look at who's been interviewed about alleged rapes during the October 7th attacks, and ends up then going and re-interviewing a handful of people who already had made assertions that they witnessed rapes. And some of these people had told varying versions of their stories, which in and of itself is not necessarily mean that they didn't witness something. I mean, these are people that were in the midst of an incredibly violent episode. But more central to that is that some of the people that the New York Times relied on to assert that there was a systematic, intentional campaign of rape weaponized by Hamas were people that have no forensic credentials, no crime scene credentials. These were people that are not legally permitted in Israel to determine rape, that they relied on these individuals to make this claim that there was a systematic rape regime implemented. And some of those people, Amy, have well-documented track records of promoting very incendiary narratives about atrocities that occurred on October 7th that were flagrantly false. Just two examples. One of the most prominent or ubiquitous figures that has emerged in Israel's narrative that Hamas committed systematic rape is an architect from New Jersey named Sherry Mendez, who is living in Israel now and is a member of the Israeli Defense Forces rabbinical unit. And she was deployed to prepare women's bodies for burial in the bases where Hamas attacked military facilities. And she's been quoted widely saying that they saw widespread evidence of rape and that she personally saw it. She described broken pelvises, not just among soldiers, but among grandmothers and children. But Sherry Mendez also was quoted by the Daily Mail as saying that a pregnant woman had a fetus cut out of her body and that the fetus was beheaded and then the mother was beheaded. This is entirely false. We've gone through all of the official records that Israel has put out on people who died that day. There was no pregnant woman killed that day. That's been thoroughly debunked. She also relied on Yossi Landau, a senior official at Zaka. Zaka has been, it's an ultra-Orthodox private rescue organization. It's been exposed by Haaretz, the newspaper in Israel, as one of the leading promoters of false information, and also that they contaminated the crime scenes by moving evidence around that actual professionals could have done. They also have promoted the beheaded baby stories, et cetera. So the New York Times, they can't find anyone who works in the rape crisis centers at the hospitals, among therapists, that are coming forward and saying, yeah, we saw this or we have documentation of this. So they go to people who already were known to have promoted false information, and then they start relying on their testimony to paint this tapestry, this notion that there was a systematic rape regime. And in the New York Times article, they do not ever disclose that their key witnesses have serious credibility problems. So this is, at a minimum, we are looking at a New York Times piece that failed to inform its readers about severe credibility issues among some of its premier witnesses, quote unquote, that it put forward in this story.
I wanted to go to a part of a podcast interview that Anat Schwartz did on January 3rd, produced by Israel's Channel 12. It was conducted in Hebrew. Here Anat talks about the difficulties and pressures in reporting the story.
Maybe the standard that we have to meet may not be realistic. Maybe it won't be this complete big story that is told from beginning to end and is complex and has details and nuances and characters. And maybe we are aiming too high. Then there was the UN woman and the silence, and there was a lot of preoccupation with it. So I said, we're missing momentum. Maybe the UN isn't addressing sexual assault because no outlet will come out with a declaration about what happened there, and that it will no longer be interesting. And at some point after one of the rewrites, we said, okay, that's it. And then I already informed all the people in the Israeli police who were waiting to see what was going on. What, was the New York Times not believing there were sexual assaults here? And I'm also in this place. I'm also an Israeli, but I also work for the New York Times. So all the time I'm like in this place between the hammer and the anvil.
That's Anat Schwartz speaking on a podcast on January 3rd. She said she felt between the hammer and the anvil, which, Jeremy, you choose as the title of your piece. Talk about the significance of that. And again, the relationship between Anat Schwartz and the other reporter, the young reporter, Adam Sella.
Well, another